Have you ever heard of the 60-year-old African woman who rose up and led an entire army to war when the men around her hesitated to fight, because her story deserves to be known and it did not end the way the British expected? Her name was Yaa Asantewaa, Queen Mother of Ejisu in the Ashanti Empire, located in present-day Ghana. And she was born around 1840 into one of the most sophisticated political systems in West Africa, where queen mothers held significant power and influence in governance and succession. By the late 19th century, the British Empire had set its sights on Ashanti territory, seeking control over its gold resources and strategic position, and after a series of brutal wars, the British exiled King Prempeh I and several Ashanti leaders to the Seychelles in 1896, leaving the empire without its central leadership and believing they had finally broken Ashanti resistance. In 1900, the British governor Frederick Hodgson made a critical and arrogant error, and he demanded to sit on the Golden Stool, not understanding that this sacred object was not merely a throne but the spiritual symbol of the Ashanti nation itself, believed to contain the very soul of the Ashanti people, passed down since the founder Osei Tutu united the Ashanti clans in the late 17th century. A council of remaining leaders gathered to discuss a response, and when some proposed negotiation or even surrender, Yaa Asantewaa rose and challenged them.
"We cannot let the white governor sit on our golden stool."
And historical accounts record that she questioned whether bravery had left the Ashanti men and declared that if the men would not stand then the women would take up arms themselves. Her words sparked the War of the Golden Stool, and Yaa Asantewaa took command of an army of approximately 5,000 warriors, laying siege to the British fort at Kumasi where Governor Hodgson and his forces were trapped for nearly 3 months, and the Ashanti forces cut off supply lines, launched attacks, and brought the British to the edge of starvation. By June 1900, Governor Hodgson and his forces had been trapped inside the Kumasi fort for nearly 2 months, and they were running out of food, water, and ammunition, and disease was spreading among the soldiers and civilians sheltering inside, and the situation was becoming desperate. On June 23, 1900, Governor Hodgson made a decision that revealed just how badly the British had underestimated the Ashanti, and under cover of darkness he abandoned the fort with a small group of soldiers and his wife, leaving behind the remaining troops and fleeing through the forest toward the coast, and this escape was humiliating for the British Empire, one of the most powerful forces on earth forced to sneak away from African warriors in the middle of the night. Meanwhile the British had dispatched Major James Wilcox with a relief force of over 1,000 soldiers, including troops from Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and other British territories, and they marched through difficult terrain facing Ashanti ambushes and resistance at every turn, and it took them weeks to reach Kumasi. When Wilcox finally reached Kumasi in July 1900, he found the remaining garrison barely holding on, and the relief of the fort was celebrated as a victory in British newspapers, but the war was far from over because Yaa Asantewaa and her forces had retreated into the forest and continued to fight. For the next several months, the Ashanti waged guerrilla warfare against British forces, using their superior knowledge of the forest to launch attacks and disappear before the British could respond, and Wilcox was forced to burn villages and destroy crops in an attempt to break Ashanti resistance, tactics that revealed the brutality of colonial warfare. By September 1900, British reinforcements had grown to nearly 4,000 soldiers, and they systematically moved through Ashanti territory, capturing leaders and crushing resistance in village after village, and the overwhelming force of modern weapons and sheer numbers began to turn the tide against the Ashanti defenders. In late 1900, Yaa Asantewaa was finally captured along with 15 other Ashanti leaders, and according to historical accounts she remained dignified and defiant even in defeat, and she was not captured in battle but was betrayed and discovered in a hiding place, yet she showed no fear when the British soldiers came for her. The British decided that Yaa Asantewaa and the other leaders were too dangerous to remain in West Africa, and they were transported over 4,000 kilometers across the ocean to the Seychelles, a remote island chain in the Indian Ocean, the same place where King Prempeh I had been exiled 4 years earlier. In the Seychelles, Yaa Asantewaa lived out the remainder of her life far from everything she knew. And she never saw her homeland again, never walked the forests of Ashanti territory, never witnessed what would become of the nation she fought to protect, and she died in exile in 1921 at approximately 80 years old. But here is what the British did not achieve, and this is the most important part of the story. Despite their military victory, despite capturing Yaa Asantewaa and the other leaders, despite burning villages and exiling the king, the British never found the Golden Stool. The Ashanti people had hidden their most sacred object so well that years of British searching produced nothing, and the location was known only to a small group of trusted keepers who passed the secret from generation to generation, risking their lives to protect what they believed was the soul of their nation. In 1920, nearly 20 years after the war, a group of road construction workers accidentally uncovered the Golden Stool from its hiding place, and instead of reporting it to authorities, some of the workers stripped the stool of its gold ornaments, not understanding or not caring about its sacred significance. When the Ashanti people discovered what had happened, the outrage was immediate and intense. And the desecration of the Golden Stool was considered one of the worst crimes imaginable in Ashanti culture, and the community demanded justice, and this put the British in a difficult position. The British were forced to put the workers on trial for theft and sacrilege, and this trial demonstrated something important. And the colonial authorities finally began to understand that the Golden Stool was not just a symbol of political power but a sacred religious object that the Ashanti would never willingly surrender. The Golden Stool was restored with new ornaments and returned to Ashanti custody, and from that point forward the British adopted a different approach, and they stopped trying to seize or control the stool and instead recognized it as Ashanti property. In 1924, King Prempeh I was finally allowed to return from exile in the Seychelles after nearly 30 years away from his homeland, and though he was not immediately restored to full power, his return was a sign that the British were slowly accepting that they could not simply erase Ashanti identity and traditions. In 1926, the British officially recognized Prempeh as the Kumasihene, the chief of Kumasi, and though this was a lesser title than his original position as Asantewaa, it marked the beginning of the restoration of Ashanti traditional authority. By 1935, the British had formally restored the Ashanti Confederacy and officially recognized the Golden Stool as the sacred property of the Ashanti people, never to be seized, touched, or sat upon by any colonial authority, and this was a complete reversal from Governor Hodgson's demand 35 years earlier. The following decade saw gradual changes in the relationship between Britain and its African colonies, and Gold Coast soldiers served in World War II alongside British forces. And after the war, calls for independence grew louder across Africa. The spirit of resistance that Yaa Asantewaa represented did not die with her in the Seychelles, and it lived on in the hearts of those who remembered her sacrifice, and it fueled the independence movements that swept across Africa in the 20th century. On March 6, 1957, the Gold Coast became Ghana, the first sub-Saharan African nation to gain independence from colonial rule, and when Kwame Nkrumah declared freedom for his nation, he was building on the foundation laid by those who had resisted before him, including Yaa Asantewaa. Today the Golden Stool remains the most sacred symbol of the Ashanti people. And it is still used in important ceremonies including the installation of new kings, and no one has ever sat on the Golden Stool, not even Ashanti kings themselves, because it represents not a seat of power but the collective soul of the nation. When a new Asantewaa is installed, he is lowered and raised over the Golden Stool 3 times without touching it, symbolizing his connection to the soul of the people without claiming ownership of it, because the stool belongs to no individual but to the entire Ashanti nation past, present, and future. Yaa Asantewaa has been immortalized across Ghana with statues, museums, and schools bearing her name, and she is celebrated every year during the Yaa Asantewaa festival in the Ashanti region, and her story is taught to children as an example of courage and sacrifice. Yaa Asantewaa died in exile 4,000 kilometers from home, but the sacred stool she fought to protect was never taken, and the kingdom she defended eventually regained its independence. Yaa Asantewaa asked whether bravery had left her people, and then she answered that question herself. Some victories are not measured in battles won, but in what remains standing after the fight is over.